Okay, so I think it's good we start with Surah Al-Fatiha. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. Maliki Yawmiddin. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين صدق الله العلي العظيم. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين ولعن الله على أعدائهم أجمعين من الأولين والآخرين آمين يا رب العالمين. أما بعد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So, tonight we don't begin with a book. We begin with 30 years. 30 years of a man who outlived his younger brother and never quite got over it. 30 years of the elder who, when his younger brother died at 47, could not even walk to the funeral, who fled instead to the shrine of Imam Musa al-Kadhim, peace and blessings be upon him, and let the vizier of the Abbasid Caliph lead the prayer in his place. 30 years of the senior scholar of his age, the most influential single Shia teacher of the 5th century of the Hijrah, the man whose books would form the intellectual foundation of every Hawza that is ever taught in any city in the Shia world. And yet, even as he carried that grief, those 30 years became the most productive years of his entire life. His scholarly output expanded. His students multiplied. His library grew to the size that the Islamic world, had not seen in private hands before. His authority spread in his own lifetime from Baghdad westward to Aleppo and Tripoli, and across the whole of the Mediterranean Levant. Listen to one short saying preserved by his younger brother in Hajj Balagha, a saying of Imam Ali, peace and blessings be upon him, on what kind of a life is worthy of the name living. Imam Ali says, and the references for all of these are in the write-up, do not be of those who hope for the hereafter without action, and do not postpone repentance through the length of their hopes. Just 22 words in English. The mark of a wasted life, hoping for what comes next while doing nothing in this one. The man we sit with tonight refused that mark. He had every excuse for it. He had grief, he had age, he had wealth and station and the kind of public exhaustion that in lesser men would have been perfectly understandable reason in order for him to slow down. But he did not slow down. He gave the next 30 years of his life, every single day of them, until his death at the age of 80 years and 8 months, to the work of his younger brother, that he could not finish, that his younger brother could not finish. Tonight we walk in the full life of Sayyid Murtadha, also known as Sharif Murtadha, also known as al-Huda, the banner of guidance. But before we start with him, let's go through a very quick recap. In session 67, 2 weeks ago, we met two brothers as boys. We met their mother walking them to the mosque of Karkh. We met the dream that brought them to Shaykh al-Mufid. We met the household into which they were born and the names their father whispered into their ears at the call to prayer. And we left them at the threshold of their lives, the soil prepared, ready for what was about to grow. Last week, in session 66, we walked the full life of the younger brother, Sayyid Radi, also known as Sharif Radi. We sat with what he produced in just 47 years, 3 commentaries on the Quran, treatises on the figurative sayings of the Prophet, a diwan of poetry that the literary critics of his age placed amongst the finest of the century, the founding of the Dar al-Ilm, the House of Knowledge in Baghdad, 80 years before the well-known Nizamiyyah was built, and the one book for which the world would remember him, Nahj Balagha, the peak of eloquence, completed in the year 400 of the Hijrah, a mere 6 years before his passing. We sat with the 3 public offices that he held from the age of 21 until his death, the Naqib al-Talibiyyin, the Amir al-Hajj, and the head of the Diwan al-Mazalim, and with the dignity he carried into all 3. We watched him refuse 1,000 gold dinars from the vizier al-Mahallabi and refused to sign the Caliph al-Qadir's denunciation of the Fatimids and respond to his dismissal from all three offices with a poem declaring that his dignity remained untouched. And we walked him to his grave, the 6th of Muharram, 406 years after Hijrah, a mere 47 years old, dying without wealth, having given everything away to his students, to the poor of the Talibid family he supervised, to the Dar al-Ilm he had founded, to the free copying of manuscripts for young scholars. We sat with the funeral. We watched Sayyid Murtadha, his elder brother, unable to bring himself to attend, fleeing instead to the shrine of Imam al-Kadhim, peace and blessings be upon him, and weeping over there. We watched Fakhr al-Mulk, the vizier of the Abbasid Caliph, the chief minister, the prime minister, you could say, of the very government that had privately despised everything Sayyid Radi stood for, step in order to lead the prayer in his place. We followed Sayyid Radi's body after its initial burial in his Karkh home through to its final transfer in Karbala, to the Ha'ir of Imam al-Hussein, the inner sanctum of Imam al-Hussein, peace and blessings be upon him, where he was laid to rest beside his father, the Naqib Sayyid Abu Ahmed al-Husseini al-Musawi. Two graves in Karbala beside the master of the martyrs, the compiler of the words of Imam Ali resting beside the body of Imam al-Hussein. That is where we left him. Tonight, we turn to the brother who buried him and to the 30 years that followed. Please give me a loud salawat and we proceed to the main section.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم.
So if Sayyid Radi was a poet, Sayyid Murtadha was the architect. Sayyid Radi gave us a book. Sayyid Murtadha gave us the structures, intellectual, institutional, spiritual, that would carry the Shia community forward through the next 2 centuries and beyond. And where Sayyid Radi's life was cut short at 47, Sayyid Murtadha was given a long life. He lived to be 80 years and 8 months old, passing away in the year 436 of the Hijrah, 30 years after his younger brother and 23 years after the death of their teacher, Shaykh al-Mufid, in 413 of the Hijrah. Those 23 years between Shaykh al-Mufid's death and his own are the years in which Sayyid Murtadha became what history remembers him as, the single most important figure in Shia scholarship of his generation. And what he did with those years is the substance of tonight's session. When Shaykh al-Mufid passed away in 413 after Hijrah, the question of who would lead the Shia community after him was, in one sense, already answered. Shaykh Mufid himself had prepared his successor. Sayyid Murtadha had studied under him for decades, had already authored major works of theology and jurisprudence, had long been recognized as Shaykh al-Mufid's most brilliant student, and had been functioning as a senior scholar in his own right for many, many years. When Shaykh al-Mufid died, the students of the Karkh Mosque did not need to look elsewhere. They had their new teacher. But the leadership Sayyid Murtadha inherited was not only a scholarly leadership, it was also an administrative one. And it had already begun, as we saw last week, with Sayyid Radi. But before we speak of the offices he held, we need to pause on the books he wrote, because the books are the reason the man is still known. And they are not remembered only by historians. They are remembered by every advanced student in the 2 great seminaries of our tradition, Qom and Najaf. Any student who has sought to reach the rank of ijtihad, the rank of an independent jurist capable of deriving the rulings of our faith from the primary sources. Let me put it as plainly as I can. In the Hawza of Najaf and the Hawza of Qom, as we sit in this majlis tonight, 1,000 years after Sayyid Murtadha's death, his books are still being opened, still being debated, and still being dissected line by line. They are not the textbooks of first and second year students. A first year student in Qom or Najaf carries other, later introductory books in his bag. But the day a student in Qom or Najaf reaches the highest level of study, which is known as Bahth al-Kharij, the advanced lectures given by the senior scholars of our age, The day that student sits at the feet of a marja' taqlid or a senior mujtahid and seeks to derive a ruling from its roots, 5 books sit open on the table in front of him. And all 5 of these books were written in Baghdad in the first third of the 5th century of the Hijrah by a scholar whose title we will soon hear, and hear properly in the dream through which he received it. Let me name these books for you because each of them is a world unto itself. The first is The Path to the Principles of the Sacred Law, one of the earliest comprehensive Shi'i works on the science of usul al-fiqh, the principles by which a jurist derives law from its sources. Every discussion of how Shia jurisprudence reasons about revelation, about how Shia jurisprudence reasons about revelation, how the scholar moves from a verse or a hadith to a ruling, begins at its roots with Sayyid Murtadha's al-Dharia. 1,000 years on, the senior scholars of Qom al-Najaf still trace the origins of their own jurisprudential principles back to this book. The second is al-Intisar, also known as the Victory, a work of comparative jurisprudence written to document the rulings on which the Imami Shia school stood apart from the schools of our Sunni brethren. When a scholar today teaches a lesson on what distinguishes the Shia legal position on ablution, prayer, marriage, inheritance, etc., al-Intisar is the foundational reference to which he will return. The third is called Tanzih al-Anbiya, the vindication of the prophets. And this is a rigorous theological defense of the doctrine of Isma, the infallibility of the prophets and the Imams. Whenever a student is faced with a Quranic verse that seems on its surface to attribute a mistake to a prophet, whether to Prophet Adam or to Prophet Moses or to others, Sayyid Murtadha's Tanzih is the book that teaches him how to read the verse properly with the tools of Arabic grammar and theological precision. The fourth is al-Shafi fil-Imama, the sufficient treatise on the Imamate, a monumental defense of the succession of Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib, peace and blessings be upon him, written specifically in response to the great Mu'tazilite scholar Qadi Abd al-Jabbar, who had challenged the Shia doctrine in his own encyclopedic work titled Al-Mughni. Al-Shafi is considered by the scholars of our tradition to be one of the most rigorous defenses of the doctrine of Imama ever written. So important was this book that Sayyid Murtadha's own student, Shaykh al-Tusi, who we'll learn about in a couple of sessions, later wrote a condensed version, a summarized version called Talkhis al-Shafi. And that summary too is still studied in the Hawza to this day. And the fifth is al-Amali al-Murtadha, or the Dictations of Murtadha. Sometimes it's also known as Ghurur al-Fawaid, the choice benefits and pearl necklaces. This is a vast literary and exegetical work that stands in the library of his brother's Nahj Balagha as its theological counterpart. Where Nahj Balagha preserves the eloquence of the Commander of the Faithful, Sayyid Murtadha's Amali preserves the depth of classical Arabic, the nuance of Quranic exegesis, and the literary horizon in which the Imams spoke. It is a masterclass in the Arabic of the Revelation. 5 books. Each of them on its own would have secured a scholar's reputation for over a century. Together, they have been the intellectual foundation of Shia jurisprudence for more than 1,000 years. Every serious Mujtahid, every Marja, every Ayatollah in Najaf or Qom and in any other Hawza that descends from these two has built his training upon them. This is what Sayyid Murtadha produced. And he produced it alongside, not instead of, the public responsibilities that he carried. Now, if you remember from last week, Sayyid Radhi held 3 official positions during his lifetime. The Naqib al-Talibiyin, the leadership of the descendants of Abu Talib, the office their father had held before them. The Amir al-Hajj, the duty to supervise the pilgrimage caravan to Mecca. And the head of the Diwan al-Mazalim, the chief of the High Court of Grievances, which in the judicial structure of the Abbasid Baghdad that I mentioned last week, was the highest appellate court of the Caliphate. the court of last resort, if you like, for those who had been wronged by the powerful. When Sayyid Radhi died in 406 after Hijrah, these three positions passed on to Sayyid Murtadha. And Sayyid Murtadha held them with a gap of only the briefest transition for the remaining 30 years of his life. The biographical sources record that he served as the head of the Diwan al-Mazalim for 30 years. 30 years as the Chief Justice of the highest court in Baghdad. 30 years ruling on the complaints of those who had been wronged. 30 years handing down verdicts in a city where the political winds could shift overnight, and a verdict against a wrong man could cost a scholar his position, his wealth, or even his life. And through all of this, he was also teaching, he was also writing, and he was also leading the Shia community, training the generation of scholars who would carry the tradition into the 5th century of the Hijrah, a generation that would include, most notably, a young man who arrived in Baghdad from the Persian city of Tus, Shaykh al-Tusi, who, as I said, we'll meet in a couple of sessions, God willing. The man Sayyid Murtadha trained for 23 years. The man who would carry everything he learned from Sayyid Murtadha out of Baghdad when the city turned on the Shia and plant it afresh in the soil of Najaf. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Of all the titles that Sayyid Murtadha carried in his lifetime, Sharif al-Murtadha, Sayyid Murtadha, Dhul Majdain, the possessor of two glories, which was given to him by the Buyid prince Bahat Dawla, the title by which he is remembered the most, and the one under which all of his books are still catalogued in every Shia library in the world, came to him through a dream that was not his own. The classical biographical sources preserve the incident with remarkable consistency. The earliest to record it, as far as we could trace, was Shahid Awwal, the first martyr, whose given name was Muhammad ibn Makki al-Amili, a great jurist of the 8th century of the Hijrah from Jabal Amil of what is today southern Lebanon, and we will meet him in this series. He earned the title the first martyr, Shahid Awwal, because it was executed by the Mamluk authorities in Damascus in the year 786 of the Hijrah for the crime of being a Shia scholar who would not renounce his faith. As I said, we will meet him properly in a future session of this sub-series. He recorded the story of Sayyid Murtadha's title in a work of his called Kitab al-Arba'in, the Book of 40, which, in the tradition of our scholars, was a genre, a collection of 40 hadith, chosen with care, each one accompanied by the scholar's own reflections, intended to transmit to future generations the narrations the scholar most wanted to safeguard, similar to Imam Khomeini's 40 hadith and so on. From Shahid Awwal's Kitab Arba'in, the story travelled. It was picked up by another 13th century Sunni historian, Ibn Khalikan, who was also a judge from what is today's Iraqi Kurdistan. And that person served as the chief judge of Damascus under the Mamluks. We've already met him last week briefly at the funeral of Sayyid Radhi, where he preserved the detail of Sayyid Murtadha's grief. He compiled one of the most celebrated biographical dictionaries in the Arabic language called Wafayat al-Ayun, the obituaries of the notables, a vast collection of the lives of the prominent figures of Islamic civilization drawn from both Shi'i and Sunni sources. And he included the entry on Sayyid Murtadha, and he included the story of the dream. Now think about this, that a Sunni judge in Mamluk Damascus would carry this narration forward without polemic is itself testimony to the power of the account. It was carried forward again by Ibn Abil Hadid, who we met in session 65 briefly, the Mu'tazilite scholar whose 20-volume commentary on Nahj al-Balagha preserves so much of our own tradition for us, who recorded it in the biographical material in the opening of his commentary. And centuries later, it was gathered into the great encyclopedic project of Allama Majlisi, the great scholar whose massive compilation, Bihar al-Anwar, also known as the Ocean of Lights, which runs into something like 110 volumes, sought to preserve in one place every narration, every account, every biographical detail that the Shia tradition had produced in 1,000 years. The Dream of the Vizier, the title given to Sayyid Murtadha, found its permanent home on his shelves. 4 sources across 4 centuries telling exactly the same story. Let me tell you what they say. It was the year 420 after Hijrah. Sayyid Murtadha was 65 years old. He had already been leading the Shia community for 7 years since Shaykh al-Mufid's death, and his reputation had reached every corner of the Abbasid capital. The vizier of the Abbasid Caliph al-Qadir, a man by the name of Muhammad ibn al-Hussein, fell gravely ill. His illness continued, no treatment seemed to help. And one night, in the depths of his illness, the minister saw a dream. In the dream, he saw the commander of the faithful, Imam Ali, and Imam Ali said to him, "Tell al-Huda, also known, the banner of guidance, to recite over you that you may be healed." The minister in his dream was confused. He asked, "O commander of the faithful, and who is Alim al-Huda?" And the Imam answered very plainly, Ali ibn al-Hussein al-Musawi. The biographical sources preserve the Arabic even of this exchange. You can find it in the write-up. The minister awoke. He wrote a letter. He addressed it to Sayyid Murtadha. He recorded what he had seen in his dream. And he wrote at the head of the letter the name by which the Imam had instructed him to address his healer, Alim al-Huda, which means the banner of guidance. And when Sayyid Murtadha received the letter and read the title by which the minister had addressed him, he refused it. He wrote back, and he said, in effect, "I am not worthy of this name. This name is too great for me. To bear such a title would be to belittle the station it names." And he asked the minister not to use it. The minister in reply explained what had happened, saying, "I did not choose this name. I was commanded to use it by the commander of the faithful himself in a dream." Sayyid Murtadha then made the recitation over him. The minister was healed. And when news of the incident reached the Caliph al-Qadir, the Caliph summoned Sayyid Murtadha. Now this is a Caliph, we should remember, whose government Sayyid Murtadha did not consider legitimate. And the Caliph said to him, "O Sayyid Murtadha, accept what your great ancestor has named you." And the Caliph ordered the government scribes from that day forward to record the name Alim al-Huda in every document that referred to him. From that day, Sayyid Murtadha became known across the Islamic world by the title his forefather, his ancestor, had given him in a dream, Alim al-Huda, or the banner of guidance. Now pause with me here, because there is something worth sitting with in this story. Sayyid Murtadha, when he received the letter, refused the title. Think about that. A man in his 60s, a scholar at the peak of his powers, the undisputed head of the Shia community, a man who could have taken a glorious title and worn it openly, and no one would have objected. And his first instinct upon receiving it was to say he did not deserve it. This name is too great for me. This is the posture of a man who understood something about titles that our age, desperate as it is for recognition, has largely and unfortunately forgotten. Titles are not achievements, they are responsibilities. A title does not tell you what you have done. It tells you what you are now obliged to become. And the bigger the title, the heavier the obligation. Alim al-Huda, the banner of guidance, is not some casual title or what we call laqab. It is a declaration that the one who bears it stands in his age as a sign by which the faithful orient themselves. That is a burden, a duty, a responsibility. And Sayyid Murtadha felt the burden before he felt the honor. And even when he accepted it, because his Imam had commanded it through a dream, and the Caliph confirmed it, and the scribes were already writing it, he accepted it as a man accepts an assignment, not as a man who accepts a prize. He spent the next 16 years of his life until his death in 436, carrying that title in the way titles are meant to be carried, by making himself, day after day, a little more worthy of it. There is a lesson here for our age, for our communities, for our scholars, for those who carry titles of their own. Shaykh, Allama, Hujjat al-Islam, Ayatollah. These are not trophies. They are not ranks to be competed for. They are assignments given by a tradition, confirmed by a community, and carrying an obligation to live up to them that does not lighten for a single day the bearer walks upon this earth. The one who takes such a title lightly or wears it arrogantly has entirely misunderstood and betrayed what he is given. Said Murtadha wept when he received this, and that weeping is the beginning of the wisdom by which such titles are supposed to be carried. Please give me a salawat. We move to the next point, which is the library, the mosque, and the 80,000 volumes.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
So I want to pause now on one detail about Sayyid Murtadha that I think more than any of his books or titles or his positions tells us what kind of scholar he was. His personal library at the time of his death was estimated as at 80,000 volumes. Think about that number, because in the 5th century of the Hijrah, it is truly staggering. 80,000 handwritten manuscripts in an age before printing, before the internet, in an age when a single copy of a single book was the labor of weeks or months by a professional scribe, in an age where entire scholarly communities might share a few hundred volumes between them. Yet one man in Baghdad had assembled 80,000. And the figure is preserved in the great biographical collections of our tradition. In books such as The Assemblies of Believers, a 16th century biographical work on the great scholars of the Shia, and in other books, saying, and he had in his house a great library of books which reached 80,000 volumes, both of his own compositions and of the compositions of others. And the references are all in the write-up. And what did he do with that library? He did not hoard it. He did not wall it off behind a private door, as lesser men with private treasures have always done. The biographical sources tell us with some tenderness that he opened his library to every serious student who walked through that gate. Be it a Shia, a Sunni, a Mu'tazili, Ash'ari, jurist, theologian, grammarian, if the student had come to learn, the manuscripts were open to him. And Sayyid Murtadha went further than just opening. He funded the students themselves. He sold parts of his inherited estates, land, property, assets that had come down to him from his noble father to provide paper, ink, and copying materials so that his students could reproduce manuscripts they were studying and carry the copies away with them. There is an account preserved in al-Khunsari's Rawdat al-Jannah, the Gardens of Paradise, which is a 19th century biographical encyclopedia of Shia scholars, which says, and the reference of course is in the write-up, and it says, and Sayyid Murtadha sold some of his estates in order to spend the proceeds upon his students and in purchasing paper and copying materials for them so that they could write with them. And he also paid his students regular monthly stipends so that poverty would never be a barrier to the pursuit of knowledge. The biographical sources preserve even the specific sums, which is quite remarkable because in the ordinary course of things, the monthly stipends paid by one scholar to his students are not the kind of detail that survives 1,000 years of transmission. That these figures survived tells us how extraordinary they were considered in their own time. Now, this account reaches us through a book by the name of The Elevated Degrees and the Classes of the Shia, which is a 17th century biographical compendium we named just a little while ago. In it, it says, and it's talking about Sayyid Murtadha, and he, Sayyid Murtadha, would disperse regular stipends upon his students. He allotted to Shaykh al-Tusi every month 12 dinars, and to Qadi Abd al-Barraj 8 dinars, and to the others according to their circumstances. The reference is, of course, in the write-up. Now, to put these sums in perspective for us, for a modern audience, a gold dinar in the 5th century of Baghdad was a substantial coin. 12 dinars a month was not pocket change. It was a genuine salary. I can't give you an exact dollar-to-dollar figure, but it was enough for a young scholar with a family to live in a house himself and to concentrate on his studies without having to worry about anything. Sayyid Murtadha was not offering tokens. He was underwriting the formation of the next generation of Shia scholarship out of his own pocket. And when in the year 422 of the Hijrah, the Hanbali faction in Baghdad rioted against the Shia community. It was one of several periodic eruptions of sectarian violence that the Buyyid protection could never really fully prevent. They burnt his father's house. The house Sayyid Murtadha had inherited, along with much of what it contained. He lost property, he lost manuscripts, he lost decades of gathered possessions. In an account preserved, again, in another book of history, references in the write-up, it is said that in the year 422, Sayyid Murtadha's father's house was burned in the Hanbali rioting. So he moved to another house in Kharkh and he returned to his lessons. Think about that phrase again, because the biographical sources, for all their density of detail, preserve it in 4 Arabic words. وَعَادَ إِلَى دُرُوسِهِ. And he returned to his lessons. He did not close the school. He did not stop teaching. He did not announce a period of mourning for his losses. He picked himself up, moved his surviving books and his students to a new location in the same neighborhood, and carried on. He was 67 years old at the time. He would live and teach for another 14 years after that fire. This was the measure of the man. And the scholars he trained, sitting in his classes, drawing his stipends, copying manuscript after manuscript from his library, carried what they had learned into every corner of the Shi'i world. 4 of them deserve, at a bare minimum, to be named. So first you have Qadi Ibn al-Barraj, the judge of Tripoli. First of the men whose stipend we've already heard, it was 8 gold coins, 8 gold dinars that Sayyid Murtadha paid him every month. His full name was Sa'ad ad-Din Abul Qasim Abdul Aziz ibn al-Barraj. He was born in around the year 400 of the Hijrah and he died in 481. The biographical sources almost never call him by his full name. They simply call him Al-Qadi Ibn al-Barraj. Ibn al-Barraj, the judge, because of the office he would come to hold and hold for decades. Ibn al-Barraj made the journey that so many scholars of his age made. From his own region, from his home region, he traveled to Baghdad to sit in the classroom of Sayyid Murtadha. He became one of Sayyid Murtadha's most brilliant students, so brilliant that Sayyid Murtadha underwrote his studies with the stipends that we've mentioned earlier, so that he could focus on his learning without the distraction of worldly worry. When Sayyid Murtadha died in 436, Ibn al-Barraj continued his studies under Shaykh al-Tusi, who, as I've said, we'll meet in a couple of sessions, God willing, completing his mastery of jurisprudence under the next generation of the chain. And then Sayyid Murtadha's plan for him unfolded. Sayyid Murtadha sent him westward, across the Iraqi desert into the mountains of Syria, to the coastal city of Tripoli in what is today northern Lebanon. To understand why this is a significant posting, you have to understand what Tripoli was in that moment. In the 11th century of the Gregorian calendar, of the Western calendar, Tripoli was not the provincial city that later history would reduce it to. It was a thriving, independent intellectual hub, ruled by the Banu Ammar, the Ammarid dynasty, who were themselves 12 Shia. They had established their own great Dar al-Ilm, house of knowledge, in Tripoli, modelled on the one Sayyid Radhi had founded in Baghdad a generation earlier, and reputed to hold hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Tripoli under Banu Ammar was one of the great Shia scholarly centres of the Mediterranean world. And into that world, Ibn al-Barraj was sent, not merely as a teacher, but as a chief judge, the Qadi of Tripoli. He held the office for between 20 and 30 years, and he was the highest legal authority in a major Mediterranean state. He did not simply teach Shia jurisprudence in a classroom, he applied it day by day in the governance of a Shia-ruled city. Marriage, inheritance, commerce, criminal law, the organization of public life, all of it passed across his desk, and he wrote. 2 of his works are still considered classics in the Hawza today. One is known as The Refined, al-Muhaddab, which is, you could say, his magnum opus. It's a comprehensive encyclopedia of Shia jurisprudence that would deeply influence al-Mahilli and the generation of scholars who would come after him. And the second one is Jawahir al-Fiqh, the jewels of jurisprudence, which is a systematic treatment of specific rulings and complex legal questions. Through Ibn al-Barraj, the scholarly inheritance Sayyid Murtadha's classroom in Baghdad reached across the Fertile Crescent and took roots on the shores of the Mediterranean. The second man, whose Persian title tells you exactly where he came from, is Salar al-Daylami. His actual name was Abu Ya'la Hamza ibn Abd al-Aziz, but the biographical sources almost never use it. They call him Salar al-Daylami. Salar from the Persian Salar, meaning commander-in-chief. Al-Daylami marking him as one of the sons of the mountains we've heard so much about in this sub-series already. Daylam, which is the highland region south of the Caspian Sea in northern Iran, the same mountains from which the Buyyid dynasty had emerged 3 generations earlier. Like Ibn al-Barraj, Salar made the scholarly migration from his homeland to Baghdad. And like Ibn al-Barraj, he studied under the full chain. First under Shaykh al-Mufid, then under Sayyid Murtadha after Shaykh al-Mufid's passing, and he maintained a lifelong intellectual relationship with his peer, Shaykh al-Tusi. Sayyid Murtadha trusted Salar's jurisprudential capabilities so deeply that he would sometimes permit Salar to teach his own classes in Baghdad on his behalf, to stand in the master's place before the master's students. And then Sayyid Murtadha sent him, as he had sent Ibn al-Barraj, westward. Salar was appointed as a judge in the region of Aleppo, Halab, in northern Syria. And here too we must pause, because Aleppo was not an accidental Shia setting. It was the fruit of a scholarly and political inheritance that reached back a full century. For most of the 10th century of the Gregorian calendar, northern Syria had been ruled by the Hamdanid dynasty, an Arab Shia Muslim house descended from the Banu Taghlib tribe of Upper Mesopotamia, whose most celebrated prince, known as Sayf ad-Dawla, the sword of the dynasty, ruled Aleppo from 945 to 967 of the Common Era, approximately 333 to 357 of the Hijri era. And Sayf ad-Dawla's court in Aleppo was one of the great cultural capitals of the Islamic classical age. The great Arabic poet of the century, al-Mutanabbi, lived at this court for 9 years and wrote his finest verses there. The great philosopher al-Farabi, who we have already named in this sub-series as the second teacher, died in Aleppo under Sayf ad-Dawla's patronage. The grammarian Ibn Jinni, the historian al-Isfahani, the preacher Ibn al-Nubata, the brightest intellectual lights of the 10th century Arab civilization, gathered at the Hamdanid court. Aleppo under Sayf ad-Dawla was to the 10th century what Baghdad under the Buyyids would shortly become to the 11th, the undisputed intellectual capital of its region under Shia political patronage. The Hamdanids were broken, eventually, by Byzantine military pressure from the north and by Fatimid pressure from the south, and their dynasty effectively ended in 1004 of the Gregorian calendar, or around 394 of the Hijri calendar. For 2 decades after their fall, Aleppo was considered contested territory. And then in around 1024, which is around 414 after Hijra, the year we have fixed on this sub-series at the moment as the moment of Shia flourishing at its peak, another Shia Arab tribal dynasty, the Mirdasids, took the city. The Mirdasids were a family of the Banu Kilab tribe, a Bedouin Arab tribe of northern Syria. And their founder, Salih ibn Mirdas, captured Aleppo from its Fatimid governor in the same year. They would rule Aleppo as a Shia tribal emirate, carefully balancing the pressures of Fatimid Cairo, Byzantine Constantinople, and Buyyid Baghdad. For most of the next 56 years, until their dynasty was, under later Seljuk pressure, compelled to convert to Sunniism and eventually absorbed into the rising Seljuk order. It was into this Shia Aleppo, this living Shia Aleppo, successor to the Hamdanid century, now governed by the Mirdasids, still a great intellectual center for the Levant, that Sayyid Murtadha sent Salar al-Daylami as a judge. And their Salar produced the work for which the Hawza still honors him 1,000 years later. This is a book called The Alawid Decrees Regarding the Prophetic Rulings, almost always referred to in the Hawza as al-Marasim. Now, al-Marasim is not merely a book of legal rulings. It is a book of legal architecture. Salar was one of the very first Shia scholars to systematically organize the entire body of Islamic jurisprudence into a logical structure, separating acts of worship, or ibadat, from everyday transactions and contracts known as mu'amalat. This classification, which Salar helped pioneer, remains the organizing principle by which every Hawza in the world structures its jurisprudential curriculum today. In fact, when you look at al-Tawzi al-Masail or Risala Amaliyah and you see the structure of it, that structure was defined by Salar Daylami. When a senior scholar says in the Hawza, according to the author of Al-Marasim, they're speaking across 1,000 years to Salar al-Daylami. The third student is a man whose very title tells you what Sayyid Murtadha thought of him. And his title is Abu Salah al-Halabi, the deputy of Sayyid Murtadha. His full name was Taqiyuddin Abu Salih Taqi ibn Najm al-Halabi, born around 374 of the Hijrah and died around 447. His epithet al-Halabi tells us his origin. He was a native of Aleppo, the same city we've just walked through, where his contemporary Salar Daylami would later serve as judge under Sayyid Murtadha's appointment. But Abu Salih was not a visitor to that city. Abu Salih was off it. When he was born around 984 of the Gregorian calendar, around 373, Aleppo was still living in the memory of the Hamdanid century. Saif al-Dawla had been dead only 17 years, and his court's glories were the stories told in the homes of Aleppo when Abu Salih was a boy. And by the time Abu Salah reached his 40s, the Mirdasids had taken the city and opened the Shia flourishing we've just described. He lived through both. The Hamdanid memory formed his childhood, and the Mirdasid flourishing enabled his career. That is the man Baghdad was about to meet. Abu Salah made the journey from Aleppo to Iraq in search of the highest scholarship of his age. And he had the rare distinction, which few scholars of any generation ever match, of studying under all three of the great teachers of the Shia chain of his lifetime. He attended the lectures of Shaykh al-Mufid towards the end of Shaykh al-Mufid's life. He became a devoted student of Sayyid Murtadha, and he later studied under Shaykh al-Tusi. Three teachers, any one of whom would have been the making of a scholar. Abu Salah sat at the feet of all three. And Sayyid Murtadha, recognizing what this man was, did something for him that he did not do for any other student. He sent Abu Salah back to Halab, back to Aleppo, back to his home city, back to the Mirdasid Shia Emirate that had just opened, but not merely as a judge and not merely as a teacher. He sent him as his own official representative, his Khalifa, his Wakil, his deputy. For the Shia communities of the entire region of Aleppo and Bilad al-Sham, Greater Syria, he was the deputy of Sayyid Murtadha. Now think about what this means politically. Sayyid Murtadha in Baghdad, the most senior Shia scholar in the Islamic world, was appointing his own personal deputy to the Shia Emirate of Aleppo across a frontier, across a political boundary, across the realm of one Shia power from in and into another. And the Mirdasid emirs received him. The scholarship of Baghdad and the scholarship of Aleppo were being stitched together by one man. And Sayyid Murtadha gave this appointment operational weight. The scope of the network of Sayyid Murtadha was running from Baghdad, was quite extraordinary. His surviving correspondence, and I want you to think back to the networks that the Imams had as well. The surviving correspondence preserved in a body of writings that later biographers call his Masail, his answers to questions, shows us that inquiries reached him from the Shia communities, reached Sayyid Murtadha from the Shia communities across the Levant and Upper Mesopotamia. Questions came from Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee, from Sidon, from Tripoli on the Lebanese coast, from Mosul in the Jazeera, and of course from Aleppo. Sayyid Murtadha was not merely the head of a Baghdad seminary. He was the central scholarly authority for the Shia of half of the Islamic world. And when letters came from Aleppo and the Levantine region around it, Sayyid Murtadha made a practice, deliberately, consistently, and publicly, of redirecting the questioners back to Abu Salah. The biographical sources record his position clearly. Shaykh Awal, who we met earlier tonight, the first martyr, referred to Abu Salah in his own writings as Sayyid Murtadha's deputy in scholarship. And Shaykh al-Thani, the second martyr, Zainuddin al-Amali, of the 10th century of the Hijrah, whom we'll meet, of course, in a future session of this sub-series, expanded upon this and explicitly described Abu Salah as Sayyid Murtadha's deputy or Khalifa in Aleppo itself. Shaykh al-Thani records, Abu Salah al-Halabi was the deputy of Sayyid Murtadha Alam al-Huda in the region of Aleppo, and a Sayyid would refer to him the questions of the people of Bilad al-Sham or Greater Syria. The reference is in the write-up. So when a believer in Aleppo or in Sidon or in Tripoli or in Tiberias or anywhere had a legal or theological question, Sayyid Murtadha in far off Baghdad would write back with the same answer he gave again and again and again. The answer was, you do not need to write to me as long as Abu Salah is amongst you. Your answer is there. The appointment was so significant that Abu Salah came to be known in the biographical literature as Khalifat al-Murtadha, the deputy of Murtadha, of Sayyid Murtadha. And after Sayyid Murtadha's death, Shaykh al-Tusi confirmed him in the same role, so that Abu Salah came to be known as Khalifat al-Shaykh, the deputy of the Shaykh. Two of the greatest scholars of the tradition across two generations delegated their authority to one man in one city. Abu Salah's masterpiece is the book we mentioned earlier in tonight's session without naming him, Al-Kafi fil Fiqh, the Sufficient in Jurisprudence. And note the title, Al-Kafi, the same word that Shaykh al-Kulayni had chosen for his hadith collection a century earlier, the same humility, the sufficient, not the complete, not the comprehensive, the sufficient, for the believer who needed to live his faith in the streets and the markets of a Shia Aleppo under the Mirdasids. And characteristically for a student of Sayyid Murtadha's school, Abu Salah did not open Al-Kafi fil Fiqh with legal rulings. He opened it with theology, with ilm al-kalam, the foundational doctrines of the faith. Because, as he understood from his teacher, a person cannot live the laws of faith without first standing on the rock of its belief. And finally, and only briefly, because the greatest of them deserves his own session and will receive it in the coming weeks, God willing, we must name the young scholar who arrived in Baghdad in the year 408 of the Hijrah, from the Persian city of Tus in Khurasan, near what is today the holy city of Mashhad. His name was Abu Ja'far Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Tusi. He was 23 years old when he arrived in Baghdad. He joined the circle of Shaykh al-Mufid and studied at his feet for 5 years, until Shaykh al-Mufid's death in 413. And then for the next 23 years, until Sayyid Murtadha's own death in 436, he became the closest disciple of Sayyid Murtadha. 23 years at the feet of one teacher, long enough to inherit everything. And when Sayyid Murtadha died, the leadership of the Shia community, the teaching, the Dar al-Ilm, the network of students, the fragile relationship with the Abbasid court, the entire inheritance of Baghdad's Shia Renaissance, the bonds with Ibn al-Barraj in Tripoli and Salar in Aleppo and Abu Salah across Greater Syria, fell upon Shaykh al-Tusi's shoulders. The Abbasid Caliph al-Qa'im himself recognized what had happened and appointed Shaykh al-Tusi to the chair of theology in Baghdad, a formal Khalifa recognition that the young man from Tus had become the successor to the lineage. What Shaykh al-Tusi would do with the inheritance, with that inheritance, how he would complete the 4 books by writing the 3rd and 4th with his own hand, how he would face the Seljuk conquest of Baghdad, how he would watch his own library burn, and how he would, in the burning rubble of that catastrophe, plant the seed of what would today be known, what is today known as the Hawza of Najaf, the scholarly institution that stands till today. All of that, God willing, is in the coming weeks. For tonight, it's enough to say Sayyid Murtadha on his deathbed in 436 knew exactly whom he was leaving his life's work to. 4 students, 4 regions, 3 dynasties, 1 teacher. Ibn al-Barraj as judge in Tripoli under the 12 Shia Ammarids. Salar al-Daylami as judge in Aleppo under the Shia Mirdasids in the living shadow of the Hamdanid century. Abu Salah al-Halabi as Khalifat al-Murtadha across the whole of Mirdasid era Aleppo and Greater Syria. And Shaykh al-Tusi in Baghdad, in what was still for another 11 years a Buyid-protected Shia flourishing, and then after the Seljuk conquest in the desert town of Najaf. 1 teacher had taught them all. Please give me a loud salawat and we move on to the next point, the final point, which is 30 years alone.
اللهم صل
اللهم
على
صل على
محمد
محمد
وآل
وآل
محمد
محمد.
وعجل فرجه.
And so Sayyid Murtadha carried on. He was 51 when his brother died. He would live for another 30 years, dying in the year 436 of the Hijrah at the age of 80 years and 8 months. 30 years is a long time to carry grief. 30 years is a long time to be the elder who outlived the younger. And yet the biological sources record that Sayyid Murtadha did not shrink from the task that now fell to him. If anything, as we've mentioned, his scholarly output expanded after his brother's death. He took over all 3 of Sayyid Radi's offices, the Niqaba, the Amir al-Hajj, Diwan al-Mazalim, and held them, as the judge at-Tanukhi recorded for the next 30 years. He continued to teach in the Dar al-Ilm, the House of Knowledge. He continued to write. He dispatched 4 great students, as we've heard, across the Levant. And the library he'd been building for decades grew to its staggering 80,000 volumes. In a sense, Sayyid Murtadha carried his brother's absence the way a man might carry a wound that never quite healed. Working around it, teaching through it, living in the knowledge that the younger brother who should have outlived him did not. And then came his own time. It was the 25th day of Rabi al-Awwal in the year 436 of the Hijrah. The Gregorian date was 1044. Sayyid Murtadha was around 80 years and 8 months old. The biographical sources tell us that al-Najashi, his student, the great biographer of the Shia tradition, whose book Al-Rijal would become one of the foundational references of Shia scholarship, was present at his master's deathbed and afterwards washed his body for burial. Salar al-Daylami, the Persian student we met earlier tonight, who had sometimes taught in Sayyid Murtadha's place, was also present and assisted. What did Sayyid Murtadha see in his final hours as he looked back across 80 years? He had seen the Buyid golden window open in his childhood, flourished through his middle years, and begin to fray in its eastern edges as the Ghaznavids pressed in. He had seen 3 Abbasid Caliphs. He had studied under Shaykh al-Mufid. He had buried his mother, his father, and 30 years before his own death, and perhaps most painfully of all, his younger brother. He had watched his house burn in the Hanbali riots of 422 and built a new one. He had written the books that would, for the next 1,000 years and beyond, form the intellectual foundation of Shia Islam. He had trained the scholars who would carry that inheritance across the Mediterranean world. He had been given a title from Imam Ali in a dream, and now he was ready to meet Imam Ali face to face. He died peacefully, the sources tell us, surrounded by his students. He too was buried initially in his own residence in the Karkh quarter of Baghdad, the same house, the same Karkh where he had lived and taught for his entire adult life. And then, following the same custom his father and his brother had followed before him, his body was transferred to Karbala. He was laid to rest beside his father, Sayyid Abu Ahmed, and beside his brother, Sayyid Radi. The 3 of them together under the shadow of the shrine of Imam al-Hussein in the Ha'ir, the inner sanctum, that, that had drawn generations of Alid scholars to its holy soil. The two brothers, who had been born 4 years apart in Baghdad and had been separated by 30 years of Sayyid Murtadha's lonely labor, were at last reunited. Not in Baghdad where they lived and taught and worked, but in Karbala, beside the grandfather whose love had shaped every line of every book either of them had ever written. So now, before we close, let us stand in our hearts at the grave. Let us make the short journey together from this gathering to Karbala. Let us walk through the streets of the holy city, past the pilgrims and the traders and the mourners, past the great golden dome of the grandfather whose martyrdom we mark with our tears in Muharram and across and through the year. Let us enter the sacred precincts of the Ha'ir, and let us stand in the stillness within, at the third grave laid beside the two we visited last week. An elder brother who carried 30 years of grief and never let it stop him, now reunited with the younger brother he could not bring himself to bury, and with the father whose office he inherited and held with honor for 30 years. Let us greet him. Peace be upon you, O Sayyid Abul Qasim Ali ibn al-Husayn al-Musawi. Peace be upon you, O Alim al-Huda, the banner of guidance, whose title the Commander of the Faithful himself chose, in a dream given to another man at his deepest point of need. Peace be upon you, you who studied under Shaykh al-Mufid for 23 years and carried his inheritance for another 23 after him. Peace be upon you, you who wrote the books that became the foundations of the Hawza, and whose words are still open for in every seminary of the Shia world more than 1,000 years later. Peace be upon you, you who sold your lands to buy paper for the students who had no such means, who paid stipends to young students who would become the architects of Islam, who built a library of 80,000 volumes and opened it to every serious seeker who walked through your gate. Peace be upon you, you whose house was burnt in the riots of 422, and who moved to another house in Kark and resumed your lessons the very next day, whose 4 Arabic words, wa'ada ila durusihi, and returned to his lessons, teach us how a scholar responds to catastrophe. Peace be upon you, you who could not bear to walk to your brother's grave, and who carried his absence for 30 years while continuing to build, to teach, and to give. Peace be upon you, you who dispatched your students across the Mediterranean and the Persian world, and whose teachings still echo from Tripoli to Aleppo to Najaf to Qom to every city where a student of the Ahlulbayt opens a book tonight. Peace be upon you, O Sharif Murtadha, the beloved of God, the one whose very name was written in the verses of the Quran before you were given it. O God, we ask you, by his love of the Ahlulbayt, by his 30 years of patient labor after his brother's departure, by the scholars he trained and the library he built and the students he fed, elevate his station amongst the saints. Place him beside his brother, beside his father, beside his grandfather in the highest place in paradise. And let every word of every book he left behind, al-Shafi, al-Dharia, Tanzih, al-Anbiya, al-Dharia, al-Amali, be a light that rises to his soul. And now the final supplication. O God, Lord of Sayyid Murtadha, who lived 80 years and 8 months and gave every one of those years to work greater than himself, we thank you tonight for the gift of his long life and for the patience with which he carried it. We thank you for the 5 books that became the foundations of our scholarly tradition, for the 80,000 manuscripts he gathered and shared, for the stipends he paid to students who could not afford their own studies, for the 4 students he dispatched across the Mediterranean to plant the seeds of his teachings in the soil that fire could not reach. And we thank you most of all for the 30 years. 30 years he carried alone, the 30 years he bore his brother's absence without ever making it a reason to stop. The 30 years in which he became, through patient labor and quiet grief, the architect of every Hawza that is ever taught in any city in the Shi'i world. O God, make us in our own work like Sayyid Murtadha was in his. When titles are placed upon us, Shaykh, Allama, Hujjat al-Islam, scholar, teacher, parent, leader, let us receive them as he received Alim al-Huda. Let us weep at the burden before we accept the honor. Let us spend the rest of our days, however many you may grant us, becoming a little more worthy of what we have been called. When fire comes for what we have built, and fire comes for every life, in some form sooner or later, let us respond as he responded, not by closing the school, not by announcing a season of mourning, but by moving to a new house in Karq and returning that very day to our lessons. وَعَادَ إِلَى دُرُوسِهِ, and he returned to his lessons. Let those 4 Arabic words be the rule of our lives in every season of loss. When grief sits beside us, as it sat beside him for 30 years, let us not let it stop us. Let us carry it the way he carried his, working around it, teaching through it, giving more of ourselves precisely because the one who would have shared the burden is no longer at our side. O God, we ask you, by your love for the Ahlulbayt, peace and blessings be upon them all, grant us tawfiq, grant us success in the work you have entrusted to us. Grant us the stamina said al-Murtadha carried into every one of his 80 years. Grant us the generosity that opened his library to every serious seeker, regardless of what tradition that seeker came from. Grant us the wisdom to dispatch what we have learned outward into our families, our communities, into the wider world, rather than hoarding it for ourselves. And O God, for our beloved master, the Imam of the age, the proof of God upon your earth, the son of Hassan al-Askari, peace and blessings be upon him and his fathers, be, O God, in this hour and in every hour, his guardian, his protector, his leader, his helper, his guide, and his watchful eye. Hasten his relief, make his hardship easy, and count us, by your mercy, among those who labour, as Sayyid Murtadha laboured for 30 years after his brother's death, to prepare the ground for the day of his return. For the occultation continues, O Lord, because we are not yet ready. Make us ready. Let every act of patient teaching, every act of quiet generosity, every act of carrying on through grief and through fire and through the closing of windows we thought would never close, be a stone we lay in the foundation of the community he will one day lead. And O God, when our own time comes, as it came for Sayyid Murtadha at 80 years and 80 months and 8 months, surrounded by the students he had trained, washed by the disciples he had taught, grant us what is known as husn al-khitama, a good ending, the ending of those whom you have chosen and who have chosen you. Let us depart this world having transferred everything we carried to the hands of those who will carry it after us. Let us depart with our work given away, our libraries opened, our students fed, our hearts at peace with the one who created us. Let us be reunited by your mercy with our beloved Sayyid Murtadha, beside his brother and his father and his grandfather, in a paradise where the soil of Karbala lies open beneath our feet and the face of our Imam. May our souls be his ransom, and may you, O our Lord, hasten his return, is the first sight our eyes meet. O God, send your blessings upon Muhammad and the family of Muhammad and hasten their relief, and may your mercy be distant from their enemies, all of them. Amen, O Lord, sustainer of the universes. Amen, O most merciful of the merciful. And before we close, just a very brief teaser for next week. So next week, God willing, in the 4th and final session of this journey through the brothers of Baghdad, we step back to meet the world that surrounded them. We will meet Ibn Sina, the philosopher who was their close contemporary. We will meet the Mu'tazilite Qadi Abd al-Jabbar, whose 20 volumes said Murtadha answered in his own 20 volumes of Shafi that we mentioned earlier today. We will meet the rising Ash'ariyya, the looming shadow of al-Ghazali. We will watch the library burn 11 years after Sayyid Murtadha's death, when the Seljuk Turks took Baghdad and reduced 80,000 handwritten manuscripts to ash. We will see what survived the burning, and then, gravely and honestly, we will pause to ask what the whole story of these two brothers is for. What it teaches us about the difference between the genuine theological commitments of the Sunni and the Shia believers across history, and the political projects, ancient and modern, that have draped themselves in religious clothing while serving entirely different masters. And we will close our 4-week journey, by God's permission, at the grave of the two brothers in Karbala, with our eyes raised towards the one in whose service they lived and died, our beloved Imam, the Mahdi of this age. May our souls be his ransom, and may God hasten his return. Until then, may God keep you and your loved ones in his care, and may he grant us the patience Sayyid Murtadha carried into every one of his 80 years. وآخر دعواني الحمد لله رب العالمين والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.